mind, spirit, or mechanics, the quantum leap from void to being. Chapter 1. Introduction, the human paradox, from void to being. Human beings have always wrestled with a single, haunting question. How does our inner experience relate to the physical universe around us? How does a creature made of carbon, water, and electrical signals come to feel things like will, identity, love, fear, and a sense of self that continues over time? And why does the lived experience of being conscious feel so different from anything physics, chemistry, or biology can describe? This dissertation tries to bridge that divide, not by reducing the spiritual to machinery or by turning physical processes into mystical ones, but by showing that ancient descriptions of human experience and modern scientific descriptions of matter, energy, and information are two different languages describing the same underlying reality. The quantum leap in the title is both literal and metaphorical. It refers to the physical moment when a quantum system collapses from many possible states into one actual state, and to the similar moment when a human mind moves from uncertainty to choice, from potential to action, from nothingness to being. To see why this bridge matters, we need to look at how humans have tried to map the inner world throughout history. The earliest long-standing traditions come from India. As early as 1500 BCE, the Vedic seers described a universe filled with pra, the subtle life energy that separates a living body from a dead one. The Upanishads, 800 to 200 BCE, expanded this into a full metaphysical system. Texts like the Bhadrayaka Upanishad and the Chandogya Upanishad taught that the individual self, Atman, is ultimately identical to Brahman, the universal ground of being. The Taittiriya Upanishad described 5 layers of the human being, from the physical body to subtler layers of energy, mind, discernment, and bliss. These weren't abstract theories. They were careful reports from meditators who spent decades observing their own consciousness. Later tantric traditions, especially in works like Prananda Yadi's Ekakranirpa, 1577, mapped the body's inner landscape in terms of chakras, wheels of energy along the spine, each linked to specific emotions, mental functions, bodily processes, and states of consciousness. These maps are not scientifically accurate in the modern sense, but they do roughly correspond to real anatomical structures like nerve plexuses, endocrine glands, and autonomic centers. The ancient practitioners were describing something real. They simply lacked modern instruments to explain it mechanically. Meanwhile, in China, another ancient system developed its own vocabulary for similar experiences. The concept of qi, appearing in texts from at least the 5th century BCE, described a vital energy flowing through the body along channels called meridians. The Huangdi Neijing, 3rd to 1st century BCE, laid out a full medical system in which health depends on the balanced flow of qi. Taoist writings like the Tao Te Ching and the works of Zhuangzi expanded this into a cosmology. The Tao, the nameless source of everything, expresses itself through the interplay of yin and yang, whose constant transformation generates the world. Like the Vedic seers, Taoist sages were reporting what they discovered through disciplined inner observation, meditation, breathwork, and movement practices that trained them to notice subtle shifts in sensation, mood, and thought. The ancient Greeks developed a parallel tradition, but with a stronger emphasis on rational analysis. The pre-Socratic philosophers searched for a single underlying substance, an arche, behind everything. Thales proposed water, Anaximenes proposed air, or pneuma. Heraclitus proposed fire, emphasizing constant change and the unity of opposites. Empedocles suggested 4 elements: earth, water, air, fire, shaped by love and strife. What matters for our purposes is how easily these thinkers moved between physical and psychological explanations. Heraclitus described the soul as a kind of fire, always changing and connected to the cosmic fire that animates the universe. For him, there was no strict line between physics and psychology. The same logos governed both the stars and the human soul. Plato formalized this into a strict dualism. In works like the Phaedo, Phaedrus, and Republic, he argued that the soul is immaterial, immortal, and fundamentally different from the body. The soul is the seat of reason and moral character. The body is a source of appetite and confusion. This view shaped Christian, Islamic, and Western thought for centuries. but it also created a problem. If mind and body are different substances, how do they interact? How does an immaterial soul move a physical arm? Aristotle offered a more integrated view. In De Anima, he defined the soul as the form of the body, the organizing principle that makes a living thing what it is. The soul is not a ghost inside the body. It is the body's own activity and organization. This is strikingly close to what modern systems theory calls an emergent property, a feature of the whole that cannot be found in its parts alone. The major religious traditions built full worldviews on these philosophical foundations. Christianity made the soul the center of moral agency and salvation. Islam described the divine spirit breathed into Adam, as the essence of human dignity. Judaism described multiple layers of soul, nefesh, ruach, neshama, from basic life force to divine consciousness. Hinduism kept the Upanishadic identity of Atman and Brahman, and yoga provided practical methods for realizing that unity. Buddhism offered a radical alternative. There is no permanent self. What we call self is a constantly changing stream of sensations, perceptions, and mental events, a view that aligns closely with modern neuroscience's understanding of the self as a constructed narrative maintained by the brain's default mode network. In medieval Europe, Thomas Aquinas blended Aristotle with Christian theology, keeping the soul as the body's form but insisting on its immortality. At the same time, alchemy, drawing on Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and early chemistry, pursued the transformation of base metals into gold as both a physical and spiritual process. The alchemist's great work was a metaphor for inner transformation. Carl Jung later recognized alchemy as a symbolic precursor to his psychology of individuation. The scientific revolution broke apart this integrated worldview. Descartes, in Meditations, 1641, established modern mind-body dualism. The mind is a thinking, non-physical substance. The body is a physical, extended substance governed by mechanical laws. Newton's Principia, 1687, completed the mechanistic picture. The universe became a deterministic clockwork with no place for consciousness in its basic description. For the next 2 centuries, materialism dominated. If the physical world is a closed system, then consciousness must either be identical to brain activity or be a powerless byproduct of it. Then came the quantum revolution. Planck, 1900, showed that energy comes in discrete packets. Einstein, 1905, proposed that light itself is made of quanta. Bohr, 1913, showed that electrons occupy discrete energy levels and make instantaneous quantum jumps. In the 1920s, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Born, and Dirac developed quantum mechanics, describing systems not by definite positions but by wave functions, probability fields of all possible outcomes. Before measurement, a system exists in a superposition of possibilities. Measurement collapses it into one actual state. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle showed that certain pairs of properties cannot be known simultaneously with unlimited precision, not because of technological limits, but because reality itself works that way. The implications were profound. At the deepest level, the universe is probabilistic, not deterministic. Outcomes emerge from fields of potential. Observation plays a role in determining what becomes real. The boundary between observer and observed is porous. These features resemble descriptions found in ancient traditions, reality crystallizing from possibility, attention shaping experience, and truth residing in dynamic processes rather than fixed substances. Stephen Hawking later extended quantum ideas to cosmology, proposing that the universe has no boundary in imaginary time, a scientific echo of ancient intuitions about being emerging from nothingness. This dissertation argues that these parallels are not accidental. They reflect a deep structural similarity between how physical systems move from potential to actuality and how human minds move from indecision to decision, from possibility to will, from latent identity to action. Ancient traditions mapped the felt side of these processes through introspection. Modern science maps the mechanistic side through measurement. Neither is complete alone. The spiritual maps describe what experience feels like, but not how it works. The scientific maps describe how the machinery works, but not what it feels like to be that machinery. This work attempts to hold both together, showing that the quantum leap from void to being is not just a metaphor but a structural description of how consciousness, will, and identity emerge from the brain and body. Chapter 2. The brain as a non-linear decision system. The human brain is often compared to a computer, but this comparison is misleading. A computer processes information in a fixed, step-by-step, deterministic sequence. The brain does nothing of the sort. Instead, it is a vast, self-organizing, non-linear system in which billions of neurons and trillions of synapses interact all at once. These interactions create patterns of activity that depend not only on current inputs but also on context, noise, and the entire history of the system's prior states. Understanding this nonlinearity is essential for understanding how decisions form, how will emerges, and why the shift from indecision to commitment resembles the quantum process in which a system collapses from many possibilities into one actual state. A linear system behaves proportionally. Double the input, double the output. Linear systems are predictable, reversible, and easy to break into parts. A nonlinear system behaves differently. Small changes in input can produce huge changes in output. The whole system behaves in ways that cannot be predicted from its parts alone. And the system's past, its trajectory through state space, matters as much as its present. Whether ecosystems and economies are nonlinear, the brain is even more so. This nonlinearity is not a flaw. It is the source of the brain's flexibility, creativity, and its ability to undergo sudden shifts that we experience as insight, decision, or transformation. Dynamical systems theory provides the mathematical language for describing nonlinear systems. It tracks how a system moves through a multidimensional state space over time. A key concept in this framework is the attractor, a region of state space toward which the system naturally gravitates. A fixed-point attractor is a resting state. A periodic attractor is a repeating cycle. A strange attractor is a fractal pattern that never exactly repeats but never leaves its structure, producing deterministic yet unpredictable behavior, what we call chaos. In the brain, attractors correspond to stable patterns of neural activity, a memory, a perception, a decision, a mood, or even an identity. At any moment, the brain is moving through a high-dimensional landscape shaped by its wiring, synaptic strengths, and neurotransmitter dynamics. Decision-making, in this view, is the brain's movement from a region where multiple attractor basins overlap, a zone of instability and open potential, into a region where one attractor becomes dominant. The work of computational neuroscientist Xiaojing Wang shows how this happens. In his models, groups of neurons representing different choices compete through mutual inhibition. As one group becomes more active, it suppresses the others, creating a winner-take-all dynamic. But the process is noisy. Random fluctuations in synaptic transmission, spike timing, and background activity influence the outcome. This noise is not a problem. It is essential. It allows the system to explore possibilities before committing. It also means that decisions are genuinely probabilistic. The same inputs can lead to different outcomes on different occasions. Decisions emerge from the interaction of evidence, noise, and nonlinear circuit dynamics, not from inputs alone. Marius Usher and James McClelland formalized this picture in their 2001 leaky competing accumulator model. In their framework, evidence for each option accumulates in separate units that gradually leak activity unless new evidence arrives. These units inhibit one another, and a decision occurs when one unit crosses a threshold. This model explains many features of human decision-making: why faster decisions tend to be less accurate, how stimulus difficulty affects reaction time, and why people show characteristic patterns of error and confidence. Most importantly, it shows that decision-making is a non-linear process in which competing possibilities are gradually narrowed to a single outcome through the interplay of evidence, noise, and thresholds. J.A. Scott Kelso introduced another crucial concept: metastability. A metastable system is neither locked into a single attractor nor drifting randomly. Instead, it hovers near attractors without being captured by them, balancing integration, parts working together, and segregation, parts acting independently. Kelso's research shows that the brain operates in this metastable regime. This allows it to maintain stable perceptions and plans while remaining ready to shift when circumstances change. Metastability is the neural signature of being on the edge of decision, open, flexible, and poised to commit. In the language of this dissertation, it is the neural equivalent of being in superposition. This scientific description aligns closely with the subjective experience of making a difficult decision. Before committing, we often feel suspended between possibilities. The mind moves back and forth, testing each option, sensing its emotional and practical weight. Time can feel strange, stretched, paused, or thickened. Then, often suddenly, the decision crystallizes. One option becomes clear, the others fall away, and a new sense of direction replaces the earlier uncertainty. Once the decision is made, it can be hard to remember what true indecision felt like. The landscape has changed. Dynamical systems theory predicts this phenomenology. The predecision state corresponds to a metastable region where multiple attractors overlap. The oscillation between options reflects the system's movement near different attractors without settling. The sudden clarity corresponds to crossing a threshold and falling into a single attractor basin, a bifurcation, a qualitative shift triggered by a quantitative change. And the irreversibility reflects the difficulty of escaping an attractor once the system has entered it. Human cultures have long described this experience in remarkably similar ways. The ancient Greeks distinguished between chronos, ordinary time, and kairos, the charged moment of decision when the future pivots. Greek tragedy's concept of moira, or fate, reflects the sense that certain outcomes draw us toward them like attractors. In Hindu thought, Dharma describes a life path that is both chosen and discovered, a pattern one is drawn toward. Taoism's Wu Wei, or effortless action, describes moving with the natural dynamics of the system rather than forcing one's will upon it. These traditions can be understood as phenomenological descriptions of what it feels like to be a nonlinear system navigating a landscape of attractors. The idea of divine guidance fits this framework as well. In a nonlinear system, decisions depend on countless factors the conscious mind cannot track: the state of billions of neurons, synaptic history, hormones, sleep, stress, social context, and a lifetime of experience. Consciousness perceives only the final outcome, the sense of rightness, the intuition that one path is the one to follow. It is natural to attribute this guidance to God, the universe, ancestors, or the Tao, because the conscious mind cannot see the underlying processes. The guidance is real. The interpretation is a story the mind uses to explain what it cannot observe. This does not diminish religious experience. It suggests that ancient spiritual language and modern nonlinear dynamics describe the same phenomenon from different angles. This view has profound implications for understanding the self. If the brain is a nonlinear dynamical system, then the self is not a fixed thing but an ongoing process, a stable pattern of activity maintained by neural architecture and attractor dynamics. The self is something the brain does, not something it has. It is a trajectory shaped by genes, experience, and the attractors that pull it forward. It can undergo abrupt transitions, metaphorical quantum leaps, from one attractor basin to another. And the feeling of free will arises from the system's sensitivity to noise, context, and subtle influences that tip the balance between competing attractors. The brain is deterministic in principle but unpredictable in practice, because its processes are too complex, too sensitive to initial conditions, and too influenced by genuine quantum randomness to forecast. This is not the dualist freedom of an immaterial soul. It is the freedom of a complex system at the edge of chaos, responsive, creative, and deeply alive. Chapter 3. Time Perception and Cognitive Density. One of the most universal features of transformative human experience, across cultures, eras, and circumstances, is a change in how time is perceived. In moments of crisis, insight, creativity, deep meditation, trauma, or ecstasy, time behaves strangely. It stretches, slows, speeds up, stops, loops, or dissolves altogether. Meditators describe an eternal now, where past and future lose their meaning. Trauma survivors often recall time slowing to a crawl, with each second expanding to contain an overwhelming amount of perception and thought. Athletes in flow say that time disappears, that hours pass in what feels like minutes, and that action and awareness merge. Mystics describe timelessness, a state where before and after, cause and effect, self and world no longer apply. These are not metaphors. They are precise descriptions of real changes in how the brain constructs temporal experience, and they mirror the way time behaves in quantum systems during transitions between states. To understand why, we must understand how the brain creates the experience of time. Unlike sight or hearing, there is no sensory organ for time. The brain does not receive time from the outside world. It builds the sense of duration by integrating many internal and external signals. Several neural systems contribute to this construction. The basal ganglia, especially the striatum, handle interval timing, estimating durations from seconds to minutes. The cerebellum manages timing on the millisecond scale, essential for movement and fine-grained perception. The insular cortex, particularly the anterior insula, integrates signals from inside the body with signals from the environment and plays a central role in subjective time. Research by Bud Craig shows that the anterior insula produces a series of global emotion moments, snapshots of the body's current state, and that the rate at which these moments are generated determines how fast or slow time feels. When interoceptive sampling speeds up, as it does during fear, arousal, or intense focus, more moments are packed into each second, and time seems to slow. When sampling slows down, as during monotony or deep absorption, fewer moments are produced, and time seems to speed up or vanish. Dopamine strongly influences this internal timing system. Dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area project to the striatum and prefrontal cortex, and their firing rate affects the speed of the brain's internal clock. High dopamine, during excitement, novelty, anticipation, or stimulant use, speeds up the internal clock, making subjective time expand. Low dopamine, during boredom, depression, or sedative states, slows the internal clock, making time contract or disappear. This is why enjoyable experiences seem to pass quickly, why waiting rooms feel endless, and why stimulants make time feel slow while depressants make it feel fast or absent. But the most profound distortions of time occur during genuine state transitions, moments when the brain reorganizes itself and shifts from one attractor state to another. Carl Friston's free energy principle and predictive processing framework offer a powerful explanation. The brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It maintains an internal model of the world and constantly predicts what will happen next. When predictions are accurate, processing is efficient and compressed. But when predictions fail, when something surprising or deeply meaningful occurs, the brain must devote extra resources to updating its model. This update is computationally expensive and involves widespread neural reorganization. During this process, the brain's normal temporal rhythm breaks down. The internal clock, which depends on regular cycles of prediction and updating, cannot maintain its usual pace when the model itself is being rebuilt. The result is the characteristic distortion of time that accompanies transformative experience. Trauma provides a clear example. During a traumatic event, the brain's predictions are violently overturned. The amygdala triggers a surge of stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, norepinephrine, that heighten arousal and accelerate interoceptive sampling. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, overwhelmed by the intensity of the signal, partially disengages from its role in constructing temporal narrative. The result is a mix of hyper-detailed perception and fragmented time. Survivors often recall vivid sensory details, colors, sounds, smells, textures, but cannot reconstruct the sequence of events. Time does not flow. It breaks. Moments become isolated fragments, suspended outside the usual structure of before and after. This is why traumatic memories behave differently from ordinary memories. They are encoded outside the normal temporal framework and resist integration. Meditation produces a different but structurally similar effect. In concentrative practices, samatha, dhyana, contemplative prayer, attention narrows to a single object. As concentration deepens, predictive updating slows. The brain receives less new information, and its internal model becomes increasingly stable. Because the sense of time depends on the rate of model updating, temporal experience begins to dissolve. In advanced meditation, practitioners report not just slow time but the disappearance of time altogether. The Buddhist insight of anicca, impermanence, describes the temporal structure of experience. Everything arises and passes. But deep meditation reveals that arising and passing are themselves mental constructions. Beneath the flow of time is a dimension of awareness that does not move, the eternal now, described across contemplative traditions. The ancient Greeks distinguished between chronos, ordinary sequential time, and kairos, the opportune moment, the threshold where something new becomes possible. Kairos is not a duration but a transition, the moment when a system shifts from one state to another. In rhetoric and theology, kairos marks the moment when action aligns perfectly with circumstance. In dynamical terms, it is the bifurcation point, the moment when a control parameter reaches a critical value and the system falls into a new attractor. Chronos is the time between transitions. Kairos is the time of transition itself. And it is precisely at these transition points that time perception is most altered, because the brain's predictive model is being rewritten. Sufi mysticism offers another perspective. The concept of waqt, the moment, describes the mystic's experience of divine presence as a timeless now. Ibn al-Arabi described creation as a continuous, moment-by-moment recreation, the universe annihilated and renewed at each instant. This is not a scientific claim but a phenomenological one, describing the experience of reality at a certain depth of contemplation. Yet it resonates with quantum mechanics, where a system state is undefined between measurements and is redetermined with each observation. The flow state, studied by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, provides a more everyday example. In flow, a person is fully absorbed in a challenging activity that matches their skill. Attention narrows, action and awareness merge, the sense of self fades, and time either accelerates or disappears. Csikszentmihalyi found these features across activities as diverse as climbing, chess, and surgery. Neurologically, flow involves transient hypofrontality, reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for self-monitoring and temporal narrative. When this region quiets down, the automatic circuits of the basal ganglia and motor cortex take over. The disappearance of time and flow is the same phenomenon as the disappearance of the self. Both depend on prefrontal functions that temporarily recede. The parallel with quantum mechanics is structural rather than literal. In quantum theory, time does not flow uniformly. During a quantum transition, when a system moves from one energy state to another, the intermediate state is undefined. The system is not in between in any classical sense. It is in one state, and then it is in the other. The quantum jump is the archetype of discontinuous change, abrupt, without intermediate stages. This mirrors the phenomenology of transformative human moments. The instant when a decision crystallizes, an insight arrives, an identity shifts, an addiction breaks, or grief turns into acceptance. There is a before state and an after state, and between them is a gap, a timeless interval where the transformation occurs. The human quantum leap is not a literal quantum event in the brain. It is a structural pattern that appears across levels of reality because it captures something fundamental about how complex systems move from potential to actuality. Chapter 4. Electrical and electromagnetic foundations of will. The human body is, among many other things, an electrochemical system. Every thought, sensation, movement, and emotion depends on electrical activity, action potentials traveling along nerves, synaptic signals crossing microscopic gaps, and field potentials created by the synchronized firing of millions of neurons. The brain alone contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each capable of firing hundreds of times per second, each action potential involving the movement of millions of ions through voltage-gated channels. Together, they generate an astonishingly complex electrical symphony, producing electromagnetic fields strong enough to be measured outside the skull by tools like EEG and MEG. The heart, with its own network of about 40,000 neurons, sometimes called the little brain, produces an electromagnetic field that can be up to 60 times stronger than the brain's and detectable several feet away. Every muscle generates electrical potentials when it contracts, and even tissues that are not part of the nervous system, bone, fascia, connective tissue, epithelium, display bioelectric properties essential for healing, development, and cellular regulation. This bioelectric reality is not a side feature of human life. It is the medium through which all neural computation, sensation, movement, emotion, and consciousness occur. A thought is a pattern of electrical activity spread across cortical and subcortical networks. An emotion is a coordinated pattern of autonomic activation, changes in heart rate, skin conductance, muscle tension, gut activity, and hormone release, driven by electrical signals from the brainstem, hypothalamus, amygdala, and insula. Will, the felt experience of choosing, committing, and directing action, is a specific pattern of prefrontal activity in which executive networks suppress competing impulses, amplify goal-relevant signals, and coordinate the motor system. Will is not an immaterial force acting on the brain. It is a reorganization of electrical activity within the brain, a shift in the system's dynamical landscape that changes which attractors dominate and which are suppressed. The electromagnetic fields generated by neural activity are not mere byproducts. Evidence increasingly suggests they help coordinate brain function. Oscillatory neural activity, rhythmic fluctuations in electrical potential at specific frequencies, is found throughout the brain and corresponds to distinct cognitive states. Delta waves, 0.5 to 4 Hz, dominate deep sleep and support restoration and memory consolidation. Theta waves, 4 to 8 Hz, appear during meditation, light sleep, and relaxed wakefulness, and are linked to memory encoding and cross-regional integration. Alpha waves, 8 to 13 Hz, dominate relaxed wakefulness with eyes closed and reflect calm alertness and reduced cortical processing. Beta waves, 13 to 30 Hz, accompany active thinking, problem-solving, and focused attention. Gamma waves, 100 plus Hz, are associated with binding information across distant brain regions, conscious awareness, and heightened perception or insight. These oscillations are not just correlated with mental states, they help create them. The brain integrates information and generates unified experience through the synchronization and desynchronization of oscillations, through coherence, phase locking, and cross-frequency coupling. When a decision is made, when will is exercised, the brain's electromagnetic landscape reorganizes. Before the decision, neural activity is desynchronized and variable. Many populations are active, competing, and generating conflicting signals. Electromagnetically, the pre-decision brain is a high-entropy system with many degrees of freedom and no dominant pattern. As the decision forms, synchronization increases. One pattern becomes dominant, competing patterns are inhibited, and the brain's electromagnetic field becomes more coherent and focused. This shift from disorder to order, from entropy to coherence, from noise to signal, is the electromagnetic signature of will. It is what will looks like from the outside, measured by electrodes and magnetometers, and what it feels like from the inside, the movement from confusion to clarity, hesitation to determination, potential to commitment. Once a decision stabilizes into a coherent electromagnetic pattern, it produces the felt sense of drive and motivation, the experience of being pulled toward a goal, of knowing what to do next. This feeling is not separate from the electrical pattern, it is the subjective experience of that pattern. The electrical state and the felt state are not cause and effect, they are two aspects of one event, the physical and the experiential. This is a form of dual-aspect monism, one underlying reality with two inseparable faces. Seen in this light, ancient concepts like pra, chi, and pneuma take on new meaning. They are not supernatural energies flowing through invisible channels. They are phenomenological descriptions, inner accounts, of real bioelectric and biomechanical processes. In the Vedic and yogic traditions, pra is the vital breath that animates the body, flowing through na with macron s and regulated through prima. The effects attributed to pra, vitality, clarity, emotional balance, health, match the physiological effects of autonomic regulation through controlled breathing. Slow, deep breathing activates the parasympathetic system, lowering heart rate, blood pressure, and cortisol while increasing vagal tone. Fast, forceful breathing activates the sympathetic system, increasing arousal and energy. The Na with macron S correspond roughly to autonomic pathways. Pra corresponds to the electrical and chemical signals traveling along them. Ancient yogis mapped the functional anatomy of the autonomic nervous system long before Western science did, using the language available to them. The same applies to qi in Chinese tradition. Qi flows through meridians and can be cultivated through qigong, taiji, and acupuncture. Modern research shows that acupuncture points often have higher electrical conductivity, that stimulating them affects autonomic activity and brain function, and that therapeutic effects involve endorphins, vagal modulation, and inflammatory pathways. Meridians may not be physical tubes, but the functional map, points where stimulation produces specific physiological effects, is real and neurologically explainable. Pneuma, in ancient Greek thought, was the animating breath or spirit. Galen described three kinds: natural pneuma, liver, metabolism; vital pneuma, heart, circulation; and psychic pneuma, brain, sensation and thought. This mirrors the body's three major regulatory systems: metabolic, cardiovascular, and nervous. Pneuma is not identical to bioelectricity, but it plays the same conceptual role: the medium that coordinates the body and enables purposeful action. The practical implication is that cultivating will, strengthening the capacity to choose, commit, and follow through, is fundamentally about training the brain's electromagnetic dynamics. This requires repetition, because stabilizing a new attractor state depends on strengthening the synaptic connections that support it. Long-term potentiation requires repeated activation. This is why contemplative traditions emphasize daily practice, why character formation emphasizes discipline and habit, and why coaches and teachers insist that transformation comes from consistent repetition. The weak electrical signals of a new intention must be reinforced until they reshape the brain's dynamical landscape, carving a new channel through which activity flows. This work is slow, difficult, and cumulative, but it is real, physical, and universal, whether described as prima, qigong, cognitive behavioral therapy, or synaptic plasticity. Chapter 5. Habit, attractors, and the deep grooves of repetition. Every human being is, to a significant degree, a creature of habit. The routines that shape daily life, how we wake, eat, move, respond to stress, relate to others, and think about ourselves, are not chosen fresh each morning. They are deeply ingrained patterns carved into the brain through years of repetition. These patterns unfold automatically in response to familiar cues, with little conscious effort. They are not just behaviors, they are neural, structural, and electromagnetic patterns. They are attractor states in the brain's dynamical landscape, basins toward which the system is pulled by the weight of its own history. Understanding habit in this way explains why change is difficult, why transformation often requires a crisis or threshold moment, and why ancient contemplative traditions insist on sustained, disciplined practice as the path to real change. The neuroscience of habit is centered on the basal ganglia, a set of deep brain structures, the caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, and substantia nigra, that help select, initiate, and execute motor programs. These structures form loops with the cerebral cortex, corticostriatal thalamic cortical loops, that process information from different cortical regions and return it through the thalamus. These loops are organized by function. Motor loops handle movement, cognitive loops handle planning and executive control, and limbic loops handle emotion and motivation. What makes these loops central to habit is a specific form of synaptic plasticity driven by dopamine. When an action unexpectedly produces reward, pleasure, relief, satisfaction, dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area and substantia nigra fire a burst of activity. This burst travels to the striatum and triggers molecular changes that strengthen the synaptic connections linking the context, encoded in cortex, to the action, encoded in striatum. This is reinforcement learning. Connections that lead to reward are strengthened, those that lead to punishment are weakened. Over many repetitions, these connections become so strong that the action is triggered automatically by the context, without conscious deliberation. This marks the shift from goal-directed behavior, controlled by anticipated outcomes, to habitual behavior, controlled by cues. The behavior becomes an attractor. When placed in the familiar context, the system flows automatically toward the familiar response. And Graybiel's pioneering work at MIT revealed the neural signature of this transition. Recording from rats' learning mazes, she found that early in learning, striatal neurons fire throughout the behavior, encoding each step. As the behavior becomes habitual, the pattern changes. Neurons fire strongly at the beginning and end, at the cue and the reward, but fall silent in the middle. The entire sequence has been chunked into a single unit that runs automatically once triggered. This chunking is the neural hallmark of habit formation. This understanding has profound implications for addiction and trauma. Gabor Mate argues that addiction is not a moral failure or genetic defect but a response to pain, especially the pain of early emotional deprivation and trauma. In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, he shows that nearly all severely addicted individuals he treated experienced childhood adversity, abuse, neglect, abandonment, violence, that left them with dysregulated stress systems and a desperate need for relief. Addictive substances and behaviors stimulate the brain's reward circuitry, flooding the striatum with dopamine and producing temporary comfort. The relief is brief, the consequences severe, and the cycle of craving, using, and withdrawal deepens the attractor in the brain's landscape. In dynamical terms, addiction is a deep attractor, a basin with steep walls and a wide catchment area. Thousands of repetitions of the craving-using relief cycle strengthen the synaptic connections that sustain it and weaken those that support alternatives. The result is a system resistant to change. The attractor is so deep that ordinary efforts, good intentions, resolutions, advice, cannot pull the system out. The addicted person is not choosing addiction. They are trapped in an attractor state that conscious will alone cannot escape. This is why Mate emphasizes compassion. The addict is constrained by neural history, not moral weakness. Trauma can also be understood as a deep attractor, but in a different dimension of the brain's landscape. A traumatic experience, especially in childhood, when the brain is still forming, does not simply create a painful memory. It reshapes the stress response system, altering the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, increasing amygdala sensitivity, reducing prefrontal regulatory capacity, and rewiring the default mode network in ways that change the person's basic sense of self and world. Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score, shows that trauma is encoded not only in explicit memory but in the body, in muscle tension, autonomic reactivity, and the felt sense of being in the world. The traumatized person does not just remember the trauma, they relive it, often unconsciously. The trauma becomes an attractor, a pattern the system returns to repeatedly because the basin is deep and easily triggered. Recovery from addiction and trauma is not a matter of willpower or insight alone. It requires reshaping the brain's dynamical landscape, building new attractors strong enough to compete with the old ones, and giving the system enough repetition, support, and energy to escape the pathological basin. This is why recovery programs emphasize daily practice: meetings, meditation, exercise, journaling, community. Each repetition strengthens the new attractor. Each day without the old pattern weakens the old one. Over months and years, the new attractor becomes stable, and the old one becomes shallow enough that the system no longer falls into it automatically. This is the neural reality behind the ancient insistence on practice. Daily prayer, meditation, ritual, discipline, not because one act produces transformation, but because repetition deepens the new groove. The Buddhist concept of saskara, habitual formations that drive suffering, is a phenomenological description of these attractor states. The Eightfold Path is a program for building new attractors, new ways of seeing, intending, speaking, acting, working, exerting effort, paying attention, and concentrating. Each is reinforced through daily practice until it becomes the dominant landscape of the mind. The Taoist cultivation of day, virtue, power, alignment with the Tao, describes the same process. The Stoic training of prohairesis, the disciplined faculty of choice, strengthens the prefrontal networks that override habitual responses and redirect the system toward new attractors. Across traditions, the diagnosis is the same. Humans are creatures of deep grooves, and liberation requires the patient, persistent creation of new ones. Chapter 7. Exceptional connectivity, intuition, and the continuum of sensitivity. Not all brains are wired the same way. The basic structure, cortex, subcortex, cerebellum, brainstem, is shared across the human species, but the details of connectivity vary enormously. Which neurons connect to which, how strongly they connect, how many synapses link them, and how patterns of excitation and inhibition are arranged differ from person to person. These differences in wiring produce differences in perception, cognition, emotion, creativity, social sensitivity, and pattern recognition. Some variations give rise to talent, genius, or intuition. Others contribute to mental illness. And some produce experiences so unusual that cultures throughout history have interpreted them as contact with the divine, the supernatural, or another realm entirely. Understanding the neural basis of these variations helps explain why certain individuals have experiences that seem to defy ordinary explanation, and why societies have consistently interpreted such experiences in spiritual terms. Intuition, the ability to know something without knowing how you know it, is one of the most common and least understood of these exceptional capacities. William James described intuition as rapid unconscious inference. The brain integrates vast amounts of information below awareness and delivers the result as a feeling of rightness, a hunch, a gut sense. Modern neuroscience supports this view and adds detail. Intuitive judgments rely on implicit learning, the brain's ability to extract statistical patterns from experience without conscious effort. These patterns form internal models that generate fast, accurate predictions in familiar situations. These predictions reach consciousness not as explicit reasoning but as feelings, images, or bodily sensations. The neural systems involved include the insular cortex, which integrates internal and external signals, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, involved in value-based decisions and somatic markers, and the basal ganglia, involved in implicit learning and pattern recognition. Exceptional intuition depends on the extent and efficiency of neural connectivity, how broadly and effectively information from different brain regions is integrated. Individuals with denser or more widely distributed connectivity can access more information, detect subtler patterns, and generate more accurate predictions. This variation arises from genetics, development, and training. Musicians develop strong connections between auditory and motor cortices, allowing them to hear music and feel it in their hands. Chess masters develop dense links between visual areas and memory systems, enabling them to see the right move instantly. Experienced clinicians develop connections between perceptual systems and vast implicit knowledge bases, allowing them to sense a diagnosis before tests confirm it. At the far end of the connectivity spectrum are individuals whose neural architecture produces experiences qualitatively different from the norm. Synesthesia, the involuntary blending of senses, such as seeing colors when hearing sounds or tasting shapes, results from atypical cross-wiring between sensory cortices and affects 2 to 4% of people. Synesthetes often report heightened creativity, stronger memory, and richer subjective experience. Savant abilities, extraordinary skills in areas like calendar calculation, music, or art, often alongside developmental disabilities, are linked to unusual connectivity patterns, including reduced inhibition and increased local connectivity. These cases suggest that the brain has extraordinary computational capacities normally constrained by inhibitory circuits. When those constraints loosen, through congenital variation, injury, or altered states, remarkable abilities can emerge. A key concept here is latent inhibition, the brain's tendency to filter out familiar, irrelevant stimuli. This filtering, mediated by dopaminergic circuits in the striatum and prefrontal cortex, is essential for functioning. Without it, the brain would be overwhelmed. Individuals with reduced latent inhibition, whether due to genetics, psychoactive substances, meditation, or other factors, experience the world as more vivid, detailed, and interconnected. They notice what others overlook. They make unusual connections. They perceive patterns others dismiss as noise. This can be a gift, the basis of creativity, insight, and artistic vision, or a burden, leading to overwhelm, confusion, and difficulty distinguishing signal from noise, as seen in certain psychotic states. This forms a continuum of sensitivity. At one end is the highly filtered, efficiently modular brain, fast, reliable, but less attuned to subtlety. At the other is the highly permeable, broadly connected brain, rich in detail but prone to overload. Most people fall somewhere in between. Where an individual lands depends on genetics, development, experience, and the current state of neuromodulators like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. The crucial factor determining whether high sensitivity leads to genius or madness, prophecy or psychosis, is not sensitivity itself but the capacity for integration and regulation, the ability to organize the flood of information into coherent patterns rather than being overwhelmed by it. This framework sheds light on cultural interpretations of exceptional sensitivity. In many indigenous cultures, shamans are individuals who have undergone what might be described clinically as a psychotic break, a temporary dissolution of ordinary reality involving visions, voices, and a disrupted sense of self, but who are supported by their community in integrating the experience. The shamanic initiation is a controlled destabilization of the attractor landscape followed by reorganization into a more connected configuration. The Greek oracles, such as the Pythia at Delphi, entered altered states in which they received divine messages. Modern interpretation suggests these states may have been induced by gases, hyperventilation, or other means of altering brain chemistry and reducing filtering. Prophets in the Abrahamic traditions, Moses, Elijah, Muhammad, Christian mystics, describe experiences involving visions, voices, dissolution of boundaries, and union with the divine. These experiences are real states of the brain, producing real changes in perception and behavior. The question is not whether they occur, but how to understand them, as supernatural contact or as the product of atypical neural connectivity operating under reduced filtering and heightened integration. The default mode network, DMN, plays a central role in this picture. The DMN, including the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, precuneus, and angular gyrus, is active during rest, self-reflection, and mind-wandering. It supports the narrative self, the ongoing story of who we are. When the DMN is active, the sense of self is strong and coherent. When it is disrupted by meditation, psychedelics, extreme stress, or certain injuries, the sense of self loosens or dissolves, producing experiences ranging from mildly unusual to profoundly transformative. Research suggests that individuals with more variable or easily disrupted DMN activity may be more prone to both mystical experiences and psychotic episodes. The same neural architecture that opens the door to transcendence can also open the door to disintegration. The difference lies not in the wiring itself, but in the individual's capacity for regulation and integration. Chapter 8. Soul as a Functional Description. The Persistent Pattern of Self. Of all the concepts in the vocabulary of human self-understanding, none is more central, more debated, or more emotionally charged than the soul. Every major civilization has had some version of it, an essential, enduring principle of identity that defines what a person truly is, that persists through the changes of life, and that may survive the body's death. In ancient Egypt, the Ka, vital force, and Ba, personality, were believed to continue after death and require the preserved body for support. In Greece, the psyche evolved from Homer's breath soul to Plato's immortal rational essence to Aristotle's conception of the soul as the form of the body. In Hinduism, the Atman is the innermost self, identical with Brahman, reincarnating through lifetimes until liberation. Buddhism uniquely denies a permanent self, the doctrine of anatta, yet affirms a continuity of process, a causal stream of mental and physical events that persists moment to moment and, in some interpretations, across lives. Christianity sees the soul as created by God, immortal, the seat of moral agency, destined for eternal judgment. Islam describes the R as the divine breath in the human being, the source of dignity and the faculty that enables relationship with God. These conceptions differ enormously in their metaphysical commitments, but they converge on a common functional description. Across traditions, the soul refers to the persistent, integrated pattern of identity, value, motivation, and self-regulation that makes a person a coherent individual over time. It is what makes you you, not the body, which constantly changes, not the memories, which are selective and reconstructed, not the personality traits, which evolve, but the deeper organizing pattern that remains stable as everything else shifts. It is the center of gravity around which a life is organized, the part that feels most essentially I. Every spiritual tradition has tried to name, understand, and cultivate this pattern. Modern neuroscience offers a way to ground this functional description in the brain without taking a position on the metaphysical claims that have historically accompanied it. The persistent pattern of self is maintained by several interacting systems. The default mode network generates the narrative self, the ongoing story of who I am. The hippocampus and medial temporal lobe structures encode and retrieve autobiographical memories, the episodes that form the raw material of that story. The ventromedial and dorsomedial prefrontal cortex evaluate actions in terms of their consistency with the self-concept, producing feelings of authenticity or betrayal. The insula integrates interoceptive signals to create the moment-by-moment sense of being a body, the felt aliveness underlying all higher self-experience. And the basal ganglia encode deep patterns of preference and response, the habits and tendencies that constitute character. The self that emerges from these systems is not a thing but a process, not a substance but a pattern. In dynamical systems terms, it is a high-dimensional attractor state in the brain's state space, a characteristic trajectory through neural activity that the system tends to revisit, maintained by synaptic architecture and resistant to but not immune from disruption. This attractor state has the properties traditions attribute to the soul. It persists over time, integrates diverse experiences into a coherent whole, provides a center of agency and motivation, and can undergo profound transformation, death and rebirth in the language of spiritual traditions, when sufficiently perturbed. The death of the ego, in mystical practice, the identity crisis described by Erik Erikson, and the psychic death and rebirth, described by Stanislav Grof in psychedelic contexts, can all be understood as the dissolution of one identity-level attractor and the emergence of another. This functional definition preserves what is most valuable in the traditional concept while remaining neutral about metaphysical questions. It does not claim the soul is immortal, nor does it deny it. The question of what happens to a pattern when its physical substrate is destroyed is philosophically open and depends on one's metaphysical commitments. It does not claim the soul is supernatural, nor does it trivialize it. The persistent, integrated, self-organizing pattern that constitutes a human identity is one of the most complex phenomena in the known universe. It deserves a name that honors that complexity. If the word soul serves that purpose, pointing to the reality of the persistent pattern without forcing conclusions about its ultimate nature, then it remains a useful and irreplaceable term. A mature interdisciplinary understanding should not eliminate it but deepen it. William James argued for a similar pragmatic approach in the varieties of religious experience. For James, the value of a concept lies not in its metaphysical pedigree but in its practical consequences, its ability to organize experience, guide action, and illuminate aspects of reality that would otherwise remain obscure. By this criterion, the concept of the soul is immensely valuable. It captures something real about personal identity, motivates the cultivation of character and meaning, and provides a vocabulary for describing the deepest transformations of human life. Neuroscience's redescription of the soul as a persistent pattern of neural activity does not diminish its significance. It enriches it, showing that the soul is not a ghost in the machine but the machine's most intricate achievement, the pattern the brain weaves from genes, experience, and choice, forming a unique center of awareness, agency, and value in the world. Chapter 9. Quantum Foundations and the Mechanics of Becoming. Quantum mechanics is the most successful physical theory ever devised. Its predictions have been confirmed with extraordinary precision, sometimes to more than 10 decimal places, and it underlies nearly every modern technology: semiconductors, lasers, MRI machines, nuclear energy, GPS, and the transistors that make digital computing possible. Yet it is also the most philosophically puzzling theory in physics, because its core ideas, superposition, entanglement, wave function collapse, complementarity, uncertainty, describe a world that looks nothing like everyday experience. This chapter does not argue that the brain is a quantum computer, or that consciousness is a quantum effect, or that people can manipulate reality through quantum means. Those claims are popular in some circles, but not supported by evidence. Instead, this chapter argues that the formal structure of quantum mechanics, the mathematical pattern describing how systems move from potential to actuality, provides the clearest structural analogy for how humans move from indecision to decision, from possibility to will, from latent identity to action. Let us begin with the basics, in the plainest language possible. In classical physics, Newton's physics, the physics of planets and billiard balls, a system is always in a definite state. A ball has a definite position and a definite velocity. If you know both at one moment, you can calculate its future with perfect accuracy. The classical universe is a giant machine, deterministic, predictable, and fully described by the positions and momenta of its particles. Quantum mechanics breaks this picture. In quantum physics, a system is not usually in a definite state. Instead, it exists in a superposition, a combination of all the states it could be found in when measured. A quantum particle does not have a definite position until it is measured. Instead, it has a probability distribution over all possible positions, encoded in a mathematical object called the wave function. The wave function describes not what the particle is doing but what it might do, the full range of its potentials. When a measurement occurs, the wave function collapses. The cloud of possibilities resolves into a single outcome, and the particle appears at a specific location. This collapse is instantaneous, discontinuous, and, in the standard Copenhagen interpretation, fundamentally random. You can calculate probabilities, but not certainties. The quantum jump is the most dramatic example. When an electron moves from one energy level to another, it does not slide gradually. It jumps, instantly, without passing through intermediate states. One moment it is in one state, the next moment it is in another. The jump occurs when the system reaches a threshold, when it absorbs or emits a photon of the right energy, and the outcome is probabilistic. You can calculate the likelihood of the jump, but not the exact moment it will happen. Before the jump, the system is in a state of potential, a superposition of possible transitions. After the jump, it is in a definite new state. The transition itself is a mystery, a point where continuous mathematics meets discontinuous reality. Now consider the structural parallels to human experience. Before a real decision, the mind is in a state of potential, a metaphorical superposition of all the possible choices, actions, and futures that might unfold. The mind oscillates among these possibilities, weighing them, feeling them, imagining them, without committing. This state is uncomfortable, anxious, uncertain, suspended. Then the decision happens, and it feels like a jump, a discontinuous shift from one state to another. You are undecided, and then you are decided. The transition is often abrupt and surprising. You did not know which way you would go until you went, and it is practically irreversible. Once the decision is made, the prior state of genuine indecision is hard to recover. The analogy to quantum collapse is not literal. The brain does not operate through quantum processes at this scale, but structural. The pattern is the same. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle offers another parallel. In quantum mechanics, certain pairs of properties, like position and momentum, cannot both be known with unlimited precision. The more precisely you know one, the less precisely you can know the other. This is not a technological limitation, it is built into reality. Human experience shows a similar complementarity. The more precisely you define your intention, the more firmly you commit to a specific course, the less freedom you retain to explore alternatives. The more clearly you know what you want, the less clearly you can imagine what you might have wanted instead. Commitment narrows possibility. It transforms a field of open potential into a definite trajectory. This is not quantum physics, it is cognitive dynamics. But the structure, the trade-off between definiteness and openness, is the same. The concept of decoherence adds another layer. In quantum mechanics, decoherence occurs when a quantum system interacts with its environment in a way that destroys superposition and forces classical behavior. Decoherence does not require a conscious observer. It happens naturally whenever a system becomes entangled with its surroundings. It explains why macroscopic objects behave classically even though they are made of quantum particles. Chapter 10. The History of Universal Mind and the Modern Universal Experience. There is a particular kind of experience that recurs across cultures, across centuries, and across the full range of human circumstances with a consistency that demands explanation. It is the experience of dissolving into the totality, of losing the boundary between self and world, inner and outer, the individual drop and the infinite ocean, and discovering that this dissolution is not annihilation but revelation. In this state, the self is experienced as identical with the universe. I am the universe, and all is one, are the characteristic reports, expressed in different languages and conceptual frameworks by mystics, philosophers, meditators, and ordinary people undergoing extraordinary circumstances throughout recorded history. The oldest and most systematic articulation of this experience comes from the Hindu tradition, specifically Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual end of the Vedas, whose greatest teacher was the 8th century philosopher Akara. Advaita Vedanta teaches that Atman, the individual self, is identical with Brahman, the universal ground of being. This identity is not metaphorical, it is the literal truth, and recognizing it is liberation, moksha. The Upanishads express this identity in their great sayings, Mahavakyas, Tat Tvam Asi, Thou art that, and Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. The practice of Advaita involves distinguishing the true self, pure, boundless consciousness, from the false self of ego, memory, habit, and desire. Its climax is a direct experience in which the boundary between self and world dissolves and the unity of Atman and Brahman is realized. Buddhism offers a different conceptual framework for a structurally similar experience. The doctrine of Pratyaya Samutpada, dependent origination, teaches that nothing exists independently, everything arises from conditions. The apparent separateness of things is an illusion. In Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva realizes the emptiness, sunyata, of all phenomena, including the self, and discovers that emptiness is not a void but a fullness, the open field from which all things arise. The Heart Sutra's formula, form is emptiness is form, expresses this insight. The experience of seeing through the illusion of separateness, realizing the interpenetration of form and emptiness, is the Buddhist equivalent of the I am the universe experience, though a Buddhist would avoid the word I, since the experience involves the dissolution of the I. Neoplatonism, founded by Plotinus in the 3rd century CE, describes a similar experience in the language of Greek philosophy. For Plotinus, ultimate reality is the one, beyond being, thought, and language, from which all things emanate. The human soul is an emanation of the One, and the goal of philosophy is to reverse this emanation, to turn inward, ascend through levels of reality, and achieve union, henosis, with the One. Plotinus describes this union with extraordinary clarity. The soul becomes what it beholds, the distinction between seer and seen dissolves, and only a single, unified experience of pure being remains. This flight of the alone to the alone became one of the most influential descriptions of mystical experience in Western thought. Sufi Islam describes the same experience as fan, the annihilation of the self in God. Sufi poets and philosophers, Rumi, Fai, Ibn al-Arabi, Al-Alj, describe the mystic's path as a progressive stripping away of the ego until nothing remains but God. Al-Alj's declaration, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth, with Allah being a name of God, is the Islamic counterpart of Aham Brahmasmi. He was executed for this statement, but within Sufism it is understood not as personal divinity but as the report of a state in which the ego has vanished and only the divine remains. The I that speaks is not the person but God speaking through an emptied self. Christian mysticism offers parallel accounts. Meister Eckhart describes Gelassenheit, letting go, in which the soul releases all attachments, including its own createdness, and discovers the divine spark within. Teresa of Avila describes the interior castle, whose innermost chamber is the place of mystical marriage with God, a union so complete that the soul cannot distinguish itself from the divine. John of the Cross describes the dark night of the soul, a period of desolation that purifies the soul for union. Though Christian mystics operate within a theistic framework that distinguishes creator from creature, their descriptions often strain or dissolve that boundary in the moment of experience. What does modern neuroscience say about these experiences? The clearest insights come from studies of psilocybin, the psychoactive compound in certain mushrooms, which reliably produces experiences of ego dissolution, cosmic unity, and the sense that self and universe are one. Robin Carhart Harris and colleagues at Imperial College London have shown through fMRI studies that psilocybin disrupts the default mode network, the brain system that constructs and maintains the narrative self. When this network is disrupted, the brain's usual self-referential processing is interrupted, and the boundaries separating self from world become permeable or dissolve. The result is the classic mystical experience: unity, timelessness, sacredness, profound meaning, and the dissolution of the ego. In human life, a similar process occurs when an internal decision becomes entangled with the external world. When you speak your intention aloud, take the first step, sign the contract, or cross the threshold, the decision becomes embedded in social, physical, and psychological consequences. Before this entanglement, the decision is still reversible. You can still change your mind. Afterward, the decision becomes effectively irreversible, stabilized by its interactions with the world. This is how potential becomes actual, how an inner leap becomes an outer reality. It is essential to be clear about what this analogy does not claim. It does not claim that the brain is a quantum computer. While some theorists, notably Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, have proposed quantum processes in neuronal microtubules as the basis of consciousness, this idea remains speculative and unsupported by current evidence. The brain operates at temperatures, scales, and timescales where quantum coherence is extremely difficult to maintain. Most neuroscientists and physicists consider quantum models of consciousness premature. The argument here is not that the brain uses quantum mechanics, but that the brain recapitulates the same formal pattern that quantum mechanics describes: the transition from potential to actuality, from superposition to collapse, from openness to commitment. This pattern is universal. It appears wherever complex systems navigate fields of possibility and resolve into definite states. It is the pattern of becoming, the pattern of the quantum leap, and it operates at every scale, from the electron to the human mind. Meditation produces similar effects through different mechanisms. Long-term meditators show reduced default mode network activity, reduced internal connectivity within the network, and increased connectivity between the default mode network and other systems. This loosening of the self-referential machinery allows experiences of non-dual awareness, ego dissolution, and the recognition that the self is a process, not a thing, precisely the insights described in contemplative traditions. When the brain systems that construct the sense of a separate self are quieted, whether by psilocybin, meditation, sensory deprivation, extreme stress, or certain injuries, the experience of separateness dissolves, revealing an awareness not bounded by the usual categories of self and other. This is the neurological basis of the I am the universe experience. This explanation does not debunk the experience. It deepens it. The fact that cosmic unity can be reliably induced by altering brain function shows something profound. The separate self is not a given, it is a construction. It is something the brain does, not something the brain is. When the brain stops doing it, what emerges is not nothingness but a different mode of awareness, one that is, in a precise sense, more fundamental than the everyday sense of self, because it is the awareness upon which the constructed self is built. The ancient mystics were right. There is a dimension of experience in which the boundary between self and world dissolves. But this dimension is not supernatural. It is the brain's deepest processing layer, normally hidden beneath the constructed surface of ordinary self-awareness and accessible, for those who know how to look, through the dissolution of the very mechanisms that ordinarily conceal it. Chapter 11. Law of Attraction as Electrical and Behavioral Dynamics. Many people talk about the law of attraction, and many people make fun of it. The basic idea is that positive thoughts bring positive results and negative thoughts bring negative results, that the universe somehow reacts to your vibration and gives you experiences that match your mindset. In its popular form, especially in The Secret, this becomes magical thinking. If you think good thoughts, the universe will rearrange itself to give you what you want. There is no scientific evidence for this. Thoughts do not send out vibrations that move physical matter. The universe does not deliver rewards to people just because they are optimistic. But the law of attraction remains popular because it exaggerates something real. It points, in a distorted way, to actual psychological and neurological processes that do connect your inner state to your outer life. This chapter explains what really happens when someone changes their basic attitude toward themselves and the world, and shows that the mechanisms involved are biological and behavioral, not mystical. The roots of the law of attraction go back to ancient Hermetic philosophy, which taught, as above, so below. This meant that the universe and the individual mirror each other. Later, the 19th century New Thought movement claimed that mind creates reality and that mental states shape physical outcomes. Thinkers like Phineas Quimby and Mary Baker Eddy helped spread these ideas. William James talked about the will to believe, meaning that believing something can help make it true. Later writers like Norman Vincent Peale and Napoleon Hill brought positive thinking ideas into mainstream culture. Over time, these ideas mixed with quantum physics buzzwords and Eastern spirituality, forming the modern law of attraction. When a person makes a deep decision about who they are or what they want, several real mechanisms activate. The brain cannot pay attention to everything. It filters information based on what feels important. A part of the brain called the reticular activating system helps decide what gets noticed. When someone makes a strong decision, I'm starting a business, I'm leaving this relationship, I'm getting sober, their attention shifts. They start noticing opportunities, people, and information that were always there but previously ignored. The world hasn't changed, their perception has. And because perception influences behavior, and behavior influences results, their life begins to change. This feels like attracting things, but it is simply how attention works. A deep decision changes how a person behaves, often without realizing it. They stand differently, speak differently, and interact differently. They may seem more confident, more open, or more focused. Other people pick up on these signals and respond with trust, respect, or support. This creates new opportunities. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy. A belief becomes true because it changes the believer's behavior in ways that help the belief come true. The body constantly broadcasts emotional signals through breath, posture, facial expression, and tone of voice. People who live in fear or shame often send out signals of threat or withdrawal, which others react to by pulling away or becoming defensive. When someone shifts their emotional state, through therapy, a major life event, or a genuine internal decision, their bodily signals change. Others sense this and respond differently. Polyvagal theory explains how the nervous system communicates safety or danger through subtle cues. When the safe and connected system is active, people naturally create better social interactions. Beliefs can change the body. The placebo effect shows that positive expectations can reduce pain, improve immune function, and change brain activity, even when the treatment is fake. The nocebo effect shows that negative expectations can cause real harm. These effects prove that belief influences biology through real neurological pathways. The chapter's main argument is that early childhood emotional experiences create deep patterns in the brain. A child who feels loved develops a stable inner pattern of safety and openness. A child who feels neglected or shamed develops a pattern of fear and withdrawal. These patterns, called attractor states, shape how the person sees the world, what they notice, how they interpret events, and how they behave. Most people live their whole lives inside these early patterns without realizing it. They cannot see the lens they are looking through. Sometimes, during a crisis or intense emotional experience, the old attractor state becomes unstable. The person enters a probability moment where deep change becomes possible. Their brain structure doesn't change, but the pattern of activation does. They are briefly in a state like superposition, able to shift from one identity to another. Then comes the real turning point, a genuine decision. Not a wish, not a resolution, but a commitment that reorganizes the person's internal electrical patterns. A new attractor state forms. This is the quantum leap of human transformation, a sudden shift from one identity to another. Recovering addicts describe it as the moment I knew I was done. Converts describe it as the moment their inner world reorganized. Survivors of near-death experiences describe it as the moment everything changed. From that identity-level choice, a cascade follows. New attention, new behavior, new social signals, new emotional regulation, and new experiences. Chapter 12. Conclusion: Ancient Maps and Modern Convergence. We have traveled a great distance in this dissertation, from the Vedic hymns of the 2nd millennium BCE to 21st century fMRI studies, from the oracle chambers of Delphi to computational models of cortical circuits, from the alchemist's workshop to the psychedelic therapy room. At every stage, the same pattern has appeared, ancient traditions describing from the inside what modern science describes from the outside, phenomenological maps overlapping with mechanistic models, the language of spirit and the language of electricity illuminating the same underlying reality. It is time to gather the threads and state, as plainly and precisely as possible, what has been learned. The central finding of this dissertation is that human experience, from the most ordinary habits to the most extraordinary mystical states, arises from the interaction of a small set of fundamental processes. Each of these processes can be described both phenomenologically, how it feels from the inside, and mechanistically, how it works in the brain and body. The first process is constrained potential. At every moment, the brain exists in a state of latent possibility, a dynamical landscape filled with multiple attractor basins, each representing a possible perception, thought, emotion, or action. This constrained potential is what the quantum wave function describes at the subatomic level, what dynamical systems theory calls the metastable regime, and what ancient traditions describe as the field of karma, the Tao, the divine ground, or the plenum of being. It is the void of the title, not empty nothingness, but a fullness of possibility. The second process is state resolution. This is the transition from potential to actuality, from superposition to a definite state, from indecision to decision, the quantum jump. In the brain, this transition is driven by nonlinear competition between neural populations, threshold crossing events, and noise, the random fluctuations in synapses, neuromodulators, and sensory input that make outcomes unpredictable even when probabilities are known. In human experience, this is the moment of decision, insight, conversion, or creative breakthrough, the moment when something new comes into being and the future pivots. In ancient traditions, this is kairos, divine intervention, enlightenment, or the karmic turning point. The third process is embodied regulation. This is the ongoing maintenance and modulation of the body's physiological state through the autonomic nervous system, endocrine system, immune system, and bioelectric dynamics. It is the substrate of will, emotion, habit, identity, and consciousness. Ancient traditions called this pra, chi, or pneuma, the vital energy flowing through the body. Modern science describes it as the electrical and biochemical activity of the nervous system, action potentials, neurotransmitter gradients, oscillations, and electromagnetic fields. The fourth process is interoceptive mapping. This is the brain's continuous monitoring and interpretation of the body's internal state, producing the felt sense of being alive, embodied, emotional, and situated. This is what the chakra system maps with remarkable accuracy, the spatial distribution of internal sensation along the body's axis, reflecting the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. Ancient practitioners, through extraordinary interoceptive training, mapped this internal geography centuries before scientific instruments existed. Their maps are not anatomically literal, but they are experientially precise. The fifth process is identity-level attractor maintenance. This is the persistence of a characteristic pattern of self-organization, the pattern of decisions, preferences, habits, values, and self-regulation that makes each person a unique center of agency. This is what traditions call the soul. Modern neuroscience describes it as the integrated activity of the default mode network, hippocampal memory systems, prefrontal executive circuits, insular interoception, and basal ganglia habits. It is not a substance but a pattern, a resilient, complex, beautiful pattern that constitutes the most intimate reality of a human life. Across all these processes, the ancient systems got one thing profoundly right: the primacy of experience. They began with the raw data of consciousness, sensation, emotion, intention, perception, the felt texture of being alive, and built outward. They understood that the body is not a vessel for the mind, but the medium through which mind exists. They recognized that transformation requires practice, sustained, disciplined repetition of new patterns. They grasped that genuine change is discontinuous, a threshold crossing, a quantum leap. And they honored the mystery of consciousness, the undeniable fact that subjective experience is the foundation of everything else. What modern science adds is mechanism, the how that complements the ancient what. The brain is a nonlinear dynamical system in a metastable regime. Decisions emerge from competitive accumulation in cortical circuits. Time perception is constructed by predictive processing. Will is an electromagnetic reorganization. Habit is the deepening of attractor basins through Hebbian learning. Interoception is mediated by the insula and autonomic pathways. The self is a persistent pattern maintained by the default mode network. Mystical experience arises from disrupting that network. The law of attraction operates through attentional bias, behavioral priming, autonomic signaling, and self-fulfilling action. None of this diminishes ancient insights. It grounds them and makes them available for integration into a unified understanding of human nature. The implications of this convergence are profound. For psychology, it suggests that therapy must address not only beliefs and behaviors but the deep attractor states, the identity-level patterns, that generate them. For spirituality, it suggests that contemplative practice is not escapism but direct engagement with the brain's fundamental processes. For philosophy of mind, it suggests that the mind-body problem is not a puzzle to solve but a duality to transcend, mind and body as two aspects of one process. The quantum leap from void to being is not a metaphor imposed on reality. It is a structural description of how reality works, at every scale, from electrons to human lives. It is the pattern by which potential becomes actual, possibility becomes commitment, the unformed becomes formed, nothing becomes something. It is the deepest pattern in nature and the deepest pattern in the human soul. Ancient traditions named it karma, dharma, Tao, pneuma, or the will of God. Modern science names it bifurcation, phase transition, attractor collapse, or state resolution. All point to the same truth. From the void of potential, being leaps into existence, in every atom, every neuron, every decision, every life.